Hey guys, I hope that you're having a good week. We have now made it to the end of our first online week, which is exciting. And today we are going to talk about glaciers. So remember that glaciers are an important part of the hydrologic cycle, which is why we are lumping them together in this week's lectures of talking about rivers groundwater. So really in this lecture, we are going to explore the mechanisms of Earth's glacial system. We're going to talk about what glaciers are and how we categorize or characterize them. So first, let's talk a bit about what are. So glacial systems are an open system of flowing ice. And so, as I mentioned, glaciers are an important part of Earth's hydrologic system. A lot of our fresh water is actually held up in the ice caps and the glacial systems on Earth's surface today. And glaciers are a system of flowing ice. So there is ice that is flowing under the force of gravity, and that's sort of the overall broad definition of a glacier is this system that is open to exchange with the atmosphere and flows under the force of gravity. So let's think a little bit more about glaciers as flowing ice. So glaciers, whether they are occurring in mountains or at our poles, are the system where ice is flowing, and it is a system where there is some balance, right? So we talk a lot about in class how things like to be in equilibrium, and glaciers are another thing that like to be in equilibrium. But since they are flowing downhill, there has to be some rate or some balance between the rate of accumulation, so how fast you're adding ice onto the glacier, and how fast the ice at the bottom of the hill, where it's a little warmer, is melting. So the balance between the rate of accumulation, or how much ice you're adding to your glacier, and the rate of melting, or how much ice you're losing from your glacier, determines the size of the glacier. So today we talk a lot about how glaciers are retreating and melting, and this is because that balance between the rate of accumulation and melting is not in equilibrium anymore. And so our glacier's rate of melting is higher than the rate of accumulation, so effectively you're going to have this mass balance of melting of glaciers, which we see as retreat on the landscape or less glaciers on the landscape overall. Let's talk a little bit more about accumulation of glacial ice. So accumulation of ice in a glacier actually happens through snow falling on top of that glacier, and then that snow being converted into something that we call granular ice. And so think about what a snowflake looks like. It has this really pretty crystal structure, very delicate. And what happens is snow is going to partially thaw and then refreeze, and it's going to lose some of that really pretty intricate crystallization. And this freezing and thawing process continues until we lose a lot of that delicate edge material, and what we end up with instead is these sort of granular globby pieces of ice. And so we see this actually happening in North Dakota when we get snowpack. So snowpack is basically the same idea of we get this thawing and refreezing of our pretty snow crystals. Maybe that gets packed under more snow on top, and so that's why we get these icy masses in glaciers, but also just as snowpack on the landscape in places where we have snow throughout the winter season. The process of adding ice to a system is called accumulation, and the process of removing ice from a glacial system is called ablation. So that word ablation just is the process of removing ice from a glacial system, and that process is usually melting. So you lose ice from a system when that ice melts and leaves the glacier as liquid water. But calving is a special type of ablation that occurs when chunks of the glacier break off into the ocean. So lots of glaciers go right up to the ocean, and then they can break off into the ocean. And so the process of calving is what actually creates icebergs. And on the next slide is this really interesting video of a documentary where they went out and documented a calving event, actually one of the largest calving events ever documented. And so enjoy that video. It's super interesting. So cool video, right? Before we move on, can you review and explain what are glaciers, what is calving, and can you explain how snow crystals change into granular ice during accumulation? The next thing to think about is glacial equilibrium. So in a glacier, we have a zone of accumulation, which is the location within the glacier where we are accumulating ice. We have a net gain of ice. And we also have a zone of ablation or a net loss of ice. So glacial equilibrium is taking into account the net gain versus the net loss of ice. And the boundary between those two zones is called the snow line because typically on a glacier, this is where you can visibly see snow appearing on the glacier. And so if we look at this diagram over here on the right, we see our zone of accumulation up here, where we have the white snow. Below that is the zone of ablation, where we have net loss of glacial ice, and then that line I drew for you is the snow line, which is the boundary between the two. So up here at the top, I'll circle the zone of accumulation. Down here is our zone of ablation, and the line between those two is the snow line. This is just a cross-section or a side view of that same process. So at the top, we have net accumulation or net gain of ice, right? So here we have our accumulation zone. You can also think of it as the input zone, where you are accumulating, inputting ice. And then we have a output zone, also called the ablation zone. You can think of this as where you have those evaporation, melting, calving processes happening. And so if we draw the snow line in between, right, so here is the snow line. Look at that beautiful handwriting. Snow line here. And above the snow line is where we have our zone of accumulation. Below the snow line is where we have our zone of ablation. So that's just the same diagram looking at it from the side. Glacial ice flows in three ways. The first way that glacial ice moves or flows is through grain rotation. So you have grains of ice, and those grains get a little melty and they can rotate under the force of gravity. And so that grain rotation is resulting in glacial flow. We also have melting and refreezing occurring. So we have our ice, it melts, it slides downhill under the force of gravity and then refreezes. That's another way that glaciers flow. And then glaciers also flow through this process of internal slipping, where you have ice layers that are able to melt a little bit in between those different ice layers and slide along those planes. So think of this maybe as like even a fault plane when we were thinking about how fault planes move relative to each other. Internal slipping, you have some weakness in your glacier that is able to allow for movement under the force of gravity. So an important thing to remember about glaciers is that they are flowing under the force of gravity. So they are always flowing downhill. And glaciers flow really slowly, and so something that you might not be able to perceive in a day. You're not going to be able to see a glacier moving in a day or maybe even a year, but over years and years, you are able to witness glacial flow. And ice flow rate varies depending on where you are within a glacier. So the middle part of the glacier, where ice is thickest, is where the ice is going to be moving or flowing most rapidly. So very similar when we talked about river velocity and how river velocity is fastest in the middle and the deepest part of the river. Near the top, same process is happening with glaciers. And so here this diagram is trying to show you that we have, say a scientist went out and lined up a bunch of boulders in a line, and then they waited a couple years and they went back to see what was happening. You can see that those boulders do not end up in a straight line anymore, and this is because there's friction along the valley wall, which means that the ice closer to the valley wall is not moving as fast as the ice in the center. Again, this is very similar to why water velocity is highest in the center of a river. And then you also get drag along the bottom where the glacier touches the bedrock. And so if a scientist went in and laid down a pipe, if you went back over time, you would see that the pipe has been deformed because the top of the glacier is moving faster than the bottom that is having friction with the bedrock. So valley walls and bedrock, anywhere where the glacier is touching something that is going to have friction with, it's going to be slower. The center of the glacier where the ice is the thickest is going to move most rapidly because there is less friction. So now let's think a little bit about glacial erosion and deposition. Remember in the rivers lecture, we said that flowing water is by far the most important erosion agent, but other things can erode sediments as well. So river water is the most important erosion agent, but groundwater can erode things like we talked about on Wednesday, and glaciers can also erode and deposit sediments. So glacial erosion is basically related to the fact that as glaciers move across a landscape, they can pull up loose fragments from the bedrock or the land that they are moving over. So that is through something called plucking. So they basically pluck up pieces of the bedrock or the ground that the glacier is moving over. And glaciers also like to carry around ground up rock. So it's very similar to how if you've ever sanded anything, they tell you don't sand in the same direction because you get these striations and grooves. The same thing happens with glaciers where you're basically carrying abrasive rocks underneath and it creates these grooves and striations as that glacier drags particles along the bedrock surface. And the cool thing about grooves and striations created by glaciers is that you can actually show or understand the direction that the ice moved. So remember way back when we talked about plate tectonics and I said, remember you can use glacial deposits to figure out old climate zones, so we know that the continents were all together at the South Pole at one point, but we also knew what direction the ice was flowing. We know what direction the ice was flowing in those paleo deposits because we have glacial striations to help us figure out what direction the glaciers were moving in the past. This picture is just showing an example of plucking and abrasion. So if you look up at the top, notice that it's labeled glacial ice. So it's not the sky. That blue is actually representing glacial ice. And it's showing us that one, the glacier is moving towards the right. And as it moves towards the right, it's doing two things. One, it is causing erosion of the bedrock through plucking. So it's actually pulling out particles from the bedrock and incorporating them into the glacial ice. And then once those particles have been plucked and they're kind of being drug along at the bottom of the glacier, what happens is they actually act sort of like sandpaper to abrade or scratch the bedrock. So glacial erosion commonly occurs through plucking and abrasion, and glacial deposition commonly occurs at the end of the glacier. So as the glacier is moving, it is eroding away material, and then at the end of the glacier, that's where it's going to be depositing material. So sediment that has been picked up from a glacier is deposited in something called a terminal moraine, which is just at the end of the glacier, it's pushed all the sediment in front of it, and then that sediment is going to be deposited in what we call a terminal moraine. And terminal moraines are the glacial deposits that mark the very farthest point that that glacier ever moved. And then as that glacier melts away, it sometimes creates something called a recessional moraine, which is just as it's melting away, it takes a little period, it deposits a little bit of sediment, it moves back some more, deposits a little bit of sediment, and keeps moving back and retreating. But as it has a little period of stability where it's not gaining or losing ice, and it's in pretty good equilibrium, you have you create something called a recessional moraine. So we get moraines, which are these big deposits of sediment. We also have meltwater associated with glacial retreat, and that meltwater actually is able to carry away and rework lots of sediments deposited in front of the glacier in something called an outwash plain. Wind can pick up really small sized particles, silt-sized particles, and we call those silt-sized particles from glaciers rock flour, or you can also call them glacial lusts. They create these really pretty blue colors in lakes. And then glacial till is unsorted sediment that has been deposited by a glacier. So the important thing to consider or think about, the most important thing when you're thinking about glacial deposition, is that glaciers have a lot of energy and they don't care about the size of the particles. They can carry really small particles to really large boulder-sized particles, think car-sized pieces of rock and bigger. And so glaciers don't really care about the size of particles. And so the sediments that glaciers deposit are all different grain sizes. And they're not very well sorted. They're just kind of a hodgepodge of lots of different sediment sizes. Before we move on, can you answer the following? What are the three processes of glacial flow? Where does glacial ice flow the fastest? What is plucking? And what is rock flour? Next, let's talk about the two types of glaciers. There's two types or classifications of glaciers. One of those is continental and the other is valley or montane. So continental glaciers are really huge ice sheets that are covering large parts of continents. So right now on Earth we have the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctica ice sheet. So our two main continental glaciers today are occurring near the poles. And then valley glaciers are glaciers that are occurring within mountains, which is why they're also sometimes called montane glaciers. So if you've ever been to the mountains and seen that you have snow caps in the mountains, think of Glacier National Park in Montana as an example of a place with valley glaciers. So in the valleys of mountains, we have glaciers as well. As I mentioned, continental glaciers are really vast ice sheets. So think of things that are continent-sized masses of ice. So today, the two that we have on Earth are the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. And ice sheets, those two, Antarctic and Greenland, include 95% of all glacier ice on Earth. So 95% of all glacier ice on Earth is in our continental glaciers, and then about 5% is included in valley glaciers. And it's important to note that glacial ice accounts for about 2% of all water on Earth, which is a pretty big percentage as we consider that most of our water on Earth is contained within the ocean. And they make up 77% of fresh water. So 77% of fresh water on Earth's surface is contained in glaciers, and so we cannot readily access it for human consumption. And so an interesting thing to note about the Antarctic ice sheet is not only does it cover all of the continent of Antarctica, but it also has ice shelves, which are these ice bodies that are sort of like tables that are resting on the ocean floor. So these ice shelves extend away from the continent and are resting in the ocean, which is pretty freaking cool. And if we had more time, we would go through a lot more of these cool features that are created by continental versus valley glaciers. But to keep it short and simple, I really want to point out glacial erratics. So glacial erratics are super big boulders that have been transported by glaciers and then dropped when that glacier started to retreat. And glacial erratics are generally evidence of a continental glacier. And I mention glacial erratics because I know that you guys have seen them around North Dakota. So anytime you see like a large boulder on the landscape, that is a boulder that was transported to North Dakota from Canada during the last glaciation, during the Pleistocene, during the Ice Age. So think of Ice Age Animals, the movie. During the last Ice Age, there were glaciers on top of North Dakota, and they transported quite a bit of large boulders here. So anytime you see large boulders on the landscape, think of all of the large boulders that are up at Medicine Wheel Park. All of those are likely glacial erratics. I know that you see them when you're driving, so when you're driving around, you can point out the window and say, that's a glacial erratic, and I know that from class, and I'll be super proud. So before we move on, can you answer the following questions? Can you give an example of a continental ice sheet on Earth's surface today? Can you tell me what glacial till is? That was back before the last pop question. And can you tell me what glacial erratics are? The second classification are valley glaciers. So we have continental glaciers as one type, and the other type are valley glaciers. And these are created in mountain regions where we have glacial ice in the tops of mountains where it's cold enough, it has a high enough altitude to maintain ice all year round. And we get lots of cool features formed from valley glaciers, but the most important feature is something called a U-shaped valley. So rivers make V-shaped valleys, and when a glacier comes through a valley, it actually curves it into a U-shaped valley through this erosion process. So if I were to ask you what the most important feature that valley glaciers create, I would answer U-shaped valley. They also create super awesome other depositional landforms and also erosional landforms. So if you've ever been to the Rocky Mountains and saw really pointy mountaintops, those are likely the result of valley glacial erosion and deposition. And so, for example, cirques and horns are examples of really pointy mountaintops. We also get some moraine deposition and outwash plains with valley glaciers as well. But the most important one that I want you guys to know is a U-shaped valley. So valley glaciers create a U-shaped valley through that erosion process. So this is just a nice little diagram to show what a U-shaped valley looks like and some of those other erosional and depositional features as well. So here I'll highlight this U-shaped valley for you. You can see over here on the edge, a normal river valley has this V shape. Here's the V shape. But a valley glacier valley is going to create a U-shaped valley. And then you can also see up here some other cool features like horns and cirques. But remember, most important thing to know is a U-shaped valley.